Everybody you see here is a contributor, and I'm going to introduce them shortly. But why don't we let you take a moment to say hello to us and through us to the readers of the WestView News.
Hello, WestView News. Hello, you all. Thank you for having me. I am Ray McGuire, and I'm running for mayor. So I'm delighted to be with you. I've heard a lot about you. I've read a few of your editions, and so it is great to be with you.
Great. Well, we appreciate it, Ray. Thanks very much. I'm going to get us started off. I'm going to ask you two questions. They're both related to public safety, and they both also involve the state, but I think these are questions that are quite germane to the mayor of New York City, and I'll explain as I go into them. So the first one I'm going to ask you about is bail reform. Now, recently you did a good conversation with Nicole Gelinas on this subject, and you talked about your support for bail reform, and you made a very compelling argument about it. Mentioning Kalief Browder, mentioning how bail can really upset the lives of people and they need to be presumed innocent. So that was all pretty good. Nicole pushed back on you with some statistics, and she's really good with statistics, and you were good with your statistics. A good statistical conversation. I'm going to ask the question a little bit differently, though. I regularly attend community council meetings with the police. I was in one just last night, and the cops on the street say, bail reform is making it hard for us to keep repeat offenders off the street. So with that, you kind of concluded by saying, it's got to be up to judges. They've got to have the discretion to decide when and if bail should be used. So the question I'm going to ask is, do you think judges have enough discretion under the current reforms around bail? And is there anything that the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice can do to help the police so that they don't feel like they can't control the streets and repeat offenders?
So I think the way I'm going to look at this is what's at the root cause of why we see the activity that we're seeing, and why are we seeing the repeat activity? And how do we address that? So rather than to get to the conclusion which we're experiencing, let's get to the definition of why we're here. If we look, and this is a continuum, the continuum starts with education. If I look at 80% of the people who either are or were in Rikers Island, 80% do not have a GED. If I look at, 18 to 24-year-old in Rikers Island, 1/3 are reading at the 5th grade level. So if I cannot participate, if I have no digital fluency, if I have no financial literacy, I have no job, I have no RIM, I have no net, I have no community center, I have no police athletic league, and I live in a relatively small apartment with a number of my siblings and my mom or dad or grandparents, you tell me, what recourse do I have? And so it's not an excuse, it's an explanation. So we need to begin to address what is a systemic issue of the systemic issue that we've seen, systemic in healthcare, in education, in the economy, and in the criminal justice system. So we need to begin to address that rather than get to the conclusion of whether or not those repeat offenders can be addressed by having more discretion or less discretion with the judges.
Okay, fair enough. Appreciate it. So the second one I'm going to ask you about is, our two state legislators, Senator Hoylman and Assemblymember Glick, are co-sponsoring legislation in Albany to ban the use of facial recognition technology and other surveillance technology. Now, meanwhile, the New York Police Department has a facial recognition unit, and they use the technology to solve crime. I've written about this in the paper. So my question to you is going to be around, there's a lot of real serious questions about facial recognition technology and its uses. It's been demonstrated that the current generation tends to create more false positives with people of color. So
Mhm.
there's a problem there. And there needs to be regulation. And of course, the New York City Police Department uses regulation. So the question is, do you think this legislation that our local legislators are pushing to ban its use until sometime in the future, is that the right way to approach it? Or would you rather not have that happen and let the New York City Police Department under your leadership regulate and use this technology to help them solve crime?
So the response is I am a huge proponent of technology. We have to investigate the origin of the algorithms. So technology used with bias implicit that existed when the algorithms were created needs to have some intervention before we deploy it more broadly, meaning the number of false positives, the number of people who get caught because the algorithms did not appropriately capture the images. In order for it to have any kind of integrity, in order for the law enforcement and the community to come together, we need to make certain that it works for all of us equitably. And today, what you've just outlined and that about what you have written says there's some questions over whether or not it is being equitably, whether or not it was drafted equitably. And therefore, if the draft has flaws to it, we ought to make certain that we pause until we can correct the draft before we go about making more mistakes.
Okay. Very well. Thank you. I appreciate it. I'm going to move on now. I'm going to introduce to you George Capsis. George is the publisher of the WestView News. He's been operating the paper for, I guess, about 18 years, and he runs it out of an office in Greenwich Village out of Sinclair Lewis's old home. So, George, why don't you go ahead?
Sinclair Lewis, that's great. One of my favorites.
I think it's very remarkable that you come from a suburban and you had to travel for an hour or more to get to school. And you made your way to Harvard. And you got yourself a degree in law. And then you went to Wall Street. So you were very removed from where you grew up. De Blasio did one thing, which I think was terrific. He came out for preschool. The cheapest dollar spent for progress is on education. And I hope you believe that. Now, we will have a different city. What is this city going to look like? What is it going to be when they keep the doors closed?
So that sounds like the question there, like what do you view the future of the city, and particularly what George says about education, because you have pretty rich experience there. Why don't you tell us what your vision is of New York City in the next few years when you become mayor?
Yeah, let me just observe one thing that amongst the many things that George said, and I have such tremendous respect for him. I am not removed. I've never been removed. Because I know the language of the streets and the suites does not mean that I'm removed. It means that I'm as close there as I've ever been. And so home never leaves me. It is my foundation, as has been education. I would not be here without education. So I am fortunate and humbled and proud that he was able to point that out. And he also pointed out one of the things that has been done relatively well, which is pre-K. I do have a plan on education, which is called Cradle to Career, Cradle to Job. Pre-K is fine, but often many of our children arrive at pre-K already behind. So I want to make certain that I begin to invest in our children at zero. From 0 to 4, I want to have affordable childcare. I want to have affordable care for the parents. And I also want to make sure that those caregivers who are taking care of our children between the ages of 0 and 4 are appropriately compensated. in 0 to 4 as our children are developing their learning. So when they get to pre-K, they're already prepared. And then I want to have, from my account, I want to be held accountable that every child in New York City can read by the end of the 3rd grade. And I also want to include in that going forward the ability to do math, because his daughter is in a field of technology, and she needs to be quite equipped when it comes to digital literacy. So I need to have these kids do math. But first, what the data has showed us and what the educators tell us and all the scientists tell us is that between 0 and the end of the 3rd grade, our children are learning to read. After that, they're reading to learn. So I want to make certain that every single child gets out of the end of the 3rd grade by being able to read. And then I want to make certain, and that means that we'll have the educators, that means that we'll have a tutor corps where we certify college students to teach, but whatever it takes, every child, no child in New York City leaves the 3rd grade without being able to read and now do math. And then I want to make certain that beginning at the 6th grade that we give our children the exposure to different professions. They can be software engineers, they can be coders, they can be programmers, they can be welders, they can be painters. And I want to make certain that they have a summer job. They need to also be, as a matter of fundamentals, they need to be digitally literate and they need to be financially literate. And when it comes to a summer job, so they can continue to explore those professions to which they've been exposed, I know the importance of a summer job. I had a summer job. I dug ditches. I laid tile. I changed bedpans. I de-seed IVs. I made boxes in the basement of Phil's dress shop. I was a gopher. But you know what? I had a job and I felt good about myself. I had some dignity and it kept me out of trouble. And then I want to make certain, so all of this is leading to, by the time our kids graduate, and I do want to increase the 25% graduation rate that exists in many of our demographics. By the time that our kids graduate, they can do one of 3 things. They can either go to the job or profession or career to which they've been exposed and for which they've had a summer job, or they can go to a 2-year or 4-year college. That's my cradle to career, cradle to job. I want to be held accountable for these kids from the time they're 0 to the time they finish and go out and be productive and contributing, participating members of New York. That's the idea. That is my educational idea. And the other thing that I've just recently come out with, because we now live in a COVID generation where we've lost a year and maybe 2, is to intervene and to have the commensurate level of urgency that's necessary here so that our kids get school during the course of the summer. So not end in June, but let's go through the course of the summer and let's continue to teach our kids, especially the ones who don't have broadband and do not have tablets or laptops. We've lost those kids. We need to rescue them.
Very good, Ray. Thank you. Appreciate it. And I'd like to move on and introduce Roger Paradiso. Roger is a filmmaker, a writer, a director, and he's done a lot of interesting work for the WestView News recently, reporting on the business community around Greenwich Village.
Hi, Ray. Thank you for coming to see us.
Hi, Roger. How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm going to continue on public housing. And I'm going to bring up 2 places that I'm pretty sure you're familiar with. Penn South, which was created by the garment workers when it was too expensive for them to live in housing there. They created this probably 6-acre complex between 26th and 29th in Chelsea, and they pay a subsidized price to buy the apartments. When they sell the apartments, they must sell it at the price they came in with. There's another place that I'm pretty sure you would know, Manhattan Plaza.
Mm-hmm.
Are you familiar with that?
I know of it. Yes, sir.
That was created by mistake. They originally put up high-rise buildings between 9th and 10th on 43rd, 44th Street. And they were creating luxury apartments. Of course, I used to work there in the 70s. I had to walk the ladies out of the office so they wouldn't get accosted on those streets by the prostitutes and pimps and drug addicts. So the luxury housing failed. But a man came up with a brilliant idea. He said, let's create subsidized housing for young artists and seniors. And it has worked splendid. It is an amazing infusion of youth and taking care of the older citizens. I think this is the kind of public housing we have to start thinking about. And I would submit that Greenwich Village, before it's wiped off the face of the earth by this gentrification that went wild, this displacement of young people, a public housing modeled on Manhattan Plaza would be brilliant for the west side of the village. And it would bring back a lot of young artists to Manhattan. We don't see that too much, and it would help seniors get decent housing. And people pay a percentage of their income. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on these concepts to lift up neighborhoods.
Yeah, Roger, what you've designed, what you've outlined is a kind of creative thinking that we're going to have to bring to this. And we're gonna see what housing stock currently exists. The problem that we have, Roger, is that when we were building in the early 2000s, we built 2.2 units of housing for every new private sector job. Today, we build 0.5 units of housing for every private sector job, which means that the demand has so exceeded the supply that it's become way too expensive. And those people who make New York what it is, and the foundation of the New York, find themselves in being displaced. So we need to find a way. What you've described in both Penn South and Manhattan Plaza are examples of the direction that we should be headed in. And so I would be, in the fact that as I think about where we are today, we need to provide subsidized housing. We also need to provide vouchers, and we need to incentivize people to be able to live in the homes, whereas you say it's commensurate with the amount of income. We have 45% of New Yorkers who are rent burdened. They pay 50 to 60+% of their income in rent. So what you're describing with that kind of graduated schedule is the direction which we should be headed.
Excellent, Ray.
Sounds great. Thank you, Ray.
When you talk about seniors, I do want to acknowledge my 95-year-old mother who lives alone, whose sacrifices got me here, and she was a social worker. So I know what it's like to live when you don't have money.
And I'd like to introduce Kari Prisco. Kari's a fashion executive based in Greenwich Village. She does a lot of work covering the Bleecker Street corridor and the small shops there. Kari, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, sure. Hello, Mr. McGuire. In your economic plan, you say you'll create a menu of financial relief options for small property owners in exchange for forgiving or lowering rent for their small business tenants. There's a lot of vacant retail space in Greenwich Village. I often say it's rather bleak on Bleecker these days. And many small businesses operate in homeowner buildings such as co-ops and condominiums. I'd love for you to describe the financial relief options you're planning and how they might apply to homeowner properties as well as traditional landlord managed properties.
So the way I think about this is I do have in my economic plan, which I've called the greatest, most inclusive economic comeback plan in the history of the city, 500,000 jobs, small businesses, which are responsible for 50% of the workers in New York, including small property owners, need to have some support, a lifeline. First, we need to cut the friggin' red tape because it's way too difficult for the small businesses to get any kind of response. It's too difficult for the small businesses to operate, to start, and it's too difficult because of the bureaucracy for them to continue to operate. I've spoken to a lot of small businesses. So what my plan is at the core of this is to take 50,000 small businesses and to give them wage subsidy, 50% of their wages we pay for a year, 1 year, which allows them to continue to be eligible for earned income tax credit. So that's one. Two, we want to see if we can help negotiate their retention of some percentage of the New York City sales tax. Number three, see if we can help negotiate relief, not only from Con Ed, because many of them pay Con Ed 100 cents on the dollar and they're making 10 cents on the dollar. So we need to intercede to see if we can't get some relief there. We need to intercede if we see if we can't get a holiday on their credit scores or their FICO scores. February of 2020, before COVID hit, so they don't get unduly penalized because of the impact of COVID, which is completely out of their control. I also want to put capital into what I call the comeback bank, and other people have now adopted that, which is essentially making certain that we can give small businesses. And at one point, I thought there were going to be three things: low interest loans, grants, and equity. Today, they can't afford a low interest loan. So it's got to be grants, and maybe we can invite some into having equity through some kind of partnership. And I want to include public-private partnerships here. The other thing that I have on my plan is to see workforce training, because what has now happened now is that the demand in the economy going forward is going to require a different skill set than many of our New Yorkers have. And the education levels that they have are going to require some kind of bridge between their education and what's required in today's environment. So my plan is for the small businesses, including the menu that I've outlined, including, by the way, since if we can't get legal counsel for the homeowners, there's clear legal counsel for the tenants, there's very little counsel for the landlords. And if I'm going to do this equitably, the landlords, we need to recognize that the landlords are also small businesses and they have bills to pay. So it can't just be, I look at this from one lens. Having managed budgets and built businesses from the ground up, I know what it's like. And so my plan is with the clear understanding of the challenges that exist with the small businesses. And the small businesses also, by the way, include small businesses that are on Broadway, the lifeblood of the city with the arts and culture. So when I think about this, I have to think about the description, definition of small businesses. I need to think about that holistically. Landlords, Broadway, restaurant owners, bars, across the gamut, small fashion retailers. We need to include each of them because that's the lifeblood of the city. And my plan is intended to address just that.
Very well, Ray. Thank you very much. I know we're at the end of our time here and you got another meeting to run to. Do you want to offer some final words to the readers of the WestView News?
Well, to the readers of the WestView News, I will say that on October the 15th, I called my then 94, 95-year-old mother and told her I quit my job. She thought I'd lost my mind. She asked why, and I said, I love this city. It's given me everything. So if I take my lived experiences, what she sacrificed for me to get here, if I take what I've been able to do in business, not only managing budgets and negotiating transactions, but also kicking the door down where I was entry as the soul brother, S-O-U-L, I made certain I wasn't the soul brother, S-O-L-E. So I've invested in creating wealth, giving people opportunity, and making certain that this city's best days are ahead of it. And so I would say finally to the West News, to the West Village News, get out the highest powered binoculars you can and look into the horizon. You may see a mirage, probably a chance you will not. There's no cavalry coming. If we don't get it done with the right leadership, it will not happen. So I come to you with a vision, somebody who doesn't have nobody's in my pocket. My sole focus is what's in the best interest of New York City.
Thank you, Ray. We appreciate it. Thank you for taking your time to meet with us and look for our next edition. We'll be featuring you.
Thank you, guys. I'm looking forward to being with you and looking forward to reading your great publication. I appreciate you. A lot of respect and admiration. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.